Ever feel like some parts of life should come with like a warning manual?
Hmm.
Well, get ready to decode one because we're diving deep into Ontario's Family Law Act.
Okay.
And trust me, this isn't just for lawyers and judges.
Right.
Whether you're like contemplating a major life change or just curious about relationships and the legal ins and outs, this deep dive is for you.
It's surprising how many people go through life with no clear understanding of family law.
Right.
And it touches so many aspects of our lives.
Exactly. And we've got the Family Law Act right here.
Okay.
But just as important, we've also got the rules that determine how it all plays out in court.
Okay.
Because laws without, procedures,
Yeah.
that's like a recipe without measurements. You might have all the ingredients, but who knows what you're going to end up with?
A very accurate analogy.
Disaster, probably.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
And just like a good recipe, we're going to break down these key ingredients, these components of the Ontario Family Law Act, and hopefully you can understand how they apply to you.
Yes.
But the preamble of this act, it kind of threw me for a loop.
Okay.
It emphasizes strengthening the family,
Okay.
which seems a bit off, considering it's often used when families are splitting apart.
It's an interesting point. But it reflects, I think, the broader aim of this act.
Okay.
It's not just about separation. It's about trying to find fair and equitable solutions when things do fall apart.
So less about declaring war and more about, aiming for a truce.
Exactly.
Yeah, the act emphasizes trying to resolve things fairly, recognizing that spouses have equal rights and responsibilities. And it even encourages things like mediation to try to avoid going to court.
Which makes a lot of sense because, let's be honest, court proceedings, they can be very emotionally draining
For everybody.
for everyone and expensive.
Yeah.
So that's a good point.
The goal is to find solutions that work for the family, even when, as the family structure evolves.
Right.
And that brings us to kind of an important point, the definition of spouse in the eyes of the law. You might think that's straightforward, but there's some nuance there.
Yeah, I was going to say, the act just throws around spouse, dependent, all these terms.
Yeah.
Like they're just simple concepts. But I have a feeling there's some curveballs in there.
Yes, there are.
What's the deal with common law relationships, for example?
Yeah.
Are they treated the same as marriages under the law in Ontario?
They can be given significant weight under Ontario law. Cohabitation, meaning, living together in a conjugal relationship, is a big factor. And the Act even recognizes agreements between unmarried couples. And that can impact things like property division and support obligations.
So even without that marriage certificate, you're still, if you're in a committed cohabitating relationship, you're building this legal framework in Ontario.
You are.
That's huge.
It really is. It underscores the importance of understanding your rights and obligations, even if you're not married, just to protect yourself and make sure you're making informed decisions.
Which leads us to what's often the biggest piece of the puzzle, property division.
Yes.
And this term, net family property, it sounds a little intimidating.
Okay.
What does that actually mean, and how is it calculated?
It sounds more complicated than it is. Net family property is essentially the value of everything that you and your spouse own together
Okay.
at the time of separation,
Okay.
minus any assets that you brought into the relationship.
So that, like, vintage comic book collection I've had since I was a kid, that's safe.
Exactly.
That's not getting split down the middle.
Things like inheritances, gifts from friends, anything you owned before the relationship started is generally excluded.
Yeah.
The focus is on what you accumulated together during the relationship.
Okay, that makes sense. Why is this concept of net family property so important?
Because it forms the basis for how assets are divided if and when a relationship ends. So understanding it's crucial for anybody in a serious relationship,
Yeah.
whether you're years away from a split or just starting out. And it really highlights the importance of things like financial transparency, open communication about money matters from the get-go, really.
So being organized is key. Even if you're not anticipating a separation at this very moment,
Exactly.
being on the same page is so important.
And that leads us very nicely into our next topic.
So we've talked about the overall aims of the act, this whole net family property idea.
Right.
But let's get real. Probably the most, emotionally charged asset in many separations
Yes.
is the house, the
Yeah.
matrimonial home.
You're absolutely right. It's not just bricks and mortar. It's, like you said, memories, stability, often the place where families are built.
Okay, so what exactly makes a home matrimonial in the eyes of the law? Right.
Is it as simple as, like, we hung our wedding photo here, so it's ours?
I wish it were that simple.
Right.
The act looks at a few things. Ownership's key, of course.
Yeah.
Did you buy it together? Is one spouse on the deed? But even if someone isn't legally on the title, the court can still say it's a matrimonial home based on, like, where did the family primarily live? Who contributed to the mortgage? Even what was the intention when they got the property?
So even if I'm the one who, like, diligently paid the mortgage every month, my spouse could still have rights to the house if we separate.
That's right, because the Act is really emphasizing fairness here. It recognizes that contributions to a marriage aren't always equal or purely financial.
Right.
It might be that one spouse stayed home, cared for the children, contributed in other ways. Right, so it's recognizing all those different types of contributions.
Exactly. And the court has the power to sort through all of that.
And speaking of power, what can the court actually do when it comes to the house, the matrimonial home?
Part 2 of the Act gives them a lot of authority. They could issue something called possession orders.
Okay.
And basically that determines who gets to live there
Okay.
during and after the separation. And it's not always about ownership. It's about who gets to possess it, often with the kid's best interests in mind.
So less about, like, who owns the bricks and more about who needs that roof, especially if there are kids involved.
Precisely. And here's where it gets interesting. The Act actually says the court has to consider the children's best interests.
Okay.
And that can even include taking their preferences into account, depending on how old they are, how mature they are.
Wow. So the kids have a voice in this too.
They can, yeah.
That's interesting.
It's about recognizing that they're impacted just as much as the adults, sometimes even more so.
For sure. For sure. Okay, well, let's shift gears a little bit to another big topic, maybe a little less warm and fuzzy.
Okay.
Child support.
Yes.
The Act mentions these child support guidelines, but I gotta be honest,
Yeah.
they sound about as much fun as doing my taxes.
I can see why you'd say that. But those guidelines serve a really important purpose. They give us a consistent framework for figuring out, like, how much should those payments be?
Okay.
The goal is fairness and predictability.
So it's not just each parent battling it out over what they each think is fair. There's actually, like, something to reference.
Right. It's based on a formula, looking mainly at each parent's income, the number of kids. Of course, there's some nuance. The court can go off those guidelines. You know, maybe there are special expenses.
Social expenses, we talking about, like, hockey leagues that cost as much as a car payment.
Exactly. Private school tuition, extraordinary medical needs, those sorts of things.
Right.
But here's something a lot of people miss. Section 39.1 of the Act, it actually lets you recalculate child support as things change.
Because life doesn't hit pause just because you sign a separation agreement, right?
Yeah.
Like, incomes change, people move, kids get older.
Exactly. The Act gets that. Life is fluid. You can make adjustments as you go to make sure things stay fair.
It's about reflecting the current situation.
Exactly.
Okay. So that actually makes me think of variation orders. Does that mean that, like, once a decision is made, it's not necessarily set in stone forever?
You got it. Life throws curveballs.
Yeah.
And variation orders are how the legal system kind of adapts to that.
Yeah.
So you can ask to change existing orders if there's been what they call a material change in circumstances.
Material change. So, like, what if my ex suddenly wins the lottery? Or, like, joins a monastery and renounces all earthly possessions?
Those would probably qualify.
Right.
But it can also be things like a big income change, up or down.
Right.
A child's needs change significantly, or maybe someone's relocating, which impacts custody, big stuff like that.
So on the one hand, having that flexibility is great. The legal system can kind of keep up with real life.
Yeah.
But I imagine it also creates a bit of uncertainty, right? Like, nothing's ever really over.
That's the double-edged sword. It's about fairness,
Yeah.
but also trying to find some finality. And that can be really tough in family law.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground on the what's and whys of Ontario's Family Law Act.
Right.
But what about the how? Those
Yeah.
all-important rules.
Yes.
The ones that determine how this actually goes down, you know, in the courtroom.
You can think of it like the act is the blueprint, and the rules are the toolkit to put it into action.
Okay.
It's about having structure, procedures in place, making sure everyone's rights are protected, and that things move along fairly and, you know, hopefully in a timely manner.
Makes sense. Makes sense. Now, one thing that seemed a little strange to me, I'm flipping through the rules here, and Rule 1.2 mentions something about redacting information from documents.
Okay.
Now, to my non-legal brain,
Yeah.
that sounds a little shady. Like, are we hiding evidence or something?
That's a fair point, but it's actually not about being secretive. It's more about finding a balance, really.
Okay.
Because these cases Family law often have really sensitive stuff in them. Could be financial records, personal struggles, maybe even who the kids are. And redacting some details just helps protect everyone's privacy, their dignity,
Yeah.
while still making sure the process is transparent.
Right, especially with like emotions running high, protecting the vulnerable is key.
Exactly.
Okay, so less about being shady, more about just being sensitive to what's being talked about.
It's about being fair and respectful to everyone involved.
Okay, then there's this whole thing about the automatic order.
Yes.
Stumbled across that one in Rule 8.0.1.
Okay.
And it's like the second you file a claim, boom, the legal system hands you this big to-do list.
You could say that. It's all about efficiency, managing expectations from day one.
Okay.
It outlines those early steps, deadlines for filing things, how people should behave during the proceedings, sets the ground rules.
So less about the outcome and more about making sure there's a clear path forward.
Exactly. Helps
Yeah.
everyone stay on track, no unnecessary delays.
Speaking of keeping things moving, and this one really threw me. Rule 2.24,
Okay, yeah,
calculating time periods.
right.
Apparently, weekends don't count if there's a short deadline.
Okay.
So does that mean lawyers are like sipping cocktails on the beach while the rest of us are stressing over paperwork?
Huh. It's not quite as glamorous as that.
Yeah.
It's really just being practical. Courts are closed on weekends.
Okay.
So those days don't count against you when things are time sensitive.
So it's more about that everyone has a fair shot to respond,
Exactly. Equal opportunity to be heard, regardless of when the deadline is.
not about lawyer vacation days. Got it. Okay, one last thing that I wanted to touch on here that caught my attention. Rule 39.34 mentions a case status coordinator. Is this like the departures board, but for divorces?
More like an air traffic controller, I guess,
Oh.
making sure everything runs smoothly. They're a great resource for anybody going through this.
Okay.
They can give you updates, answer those procedural questions you might have, really helpful guides.
So a friendly voice in what can feel like a very overwhelming process.
Exactly. They make it less daunting.
Well, listener, we've done it. We've taken a deep dive into Ontario's Family Law Act and all those rules that go with it.
And it is a lot to take in. What we've talked about is really just a starting point.
Absolutely. But if our listeners could take away one thing from all of this, what would it be?
Don't wait until you're in a crisis to start figuring this stuff out.
Yeah.
Get informed early. And remember, court isn't the only option. There are things like mediation, which can be a lot less stressful for everyone, and honestly, sometimes lead to better outcomes.
Solid advice.
Mhm.
And as we wrap up, here's something to think about. The Act, it talks a lot about equality between spouses.
Right.
But how does that actually work in real life when, let's say, there are power imbalances in the relationship, or if one person has a lot more money than the other?
That's a really good question.
Big questions, no easy answers, but definitely something to keep in mind.
Absolutely. It shows how, the law sets up the framework, but real life is where it gets really complicated.
It does. Well, until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and remember, when it comes to family law, you're not alone.